We also have live interpretation from English to Tamil and English to Hindi for the main session today. Please note that the live interpretation will not be available in the breakout segment of the session. To use the live interpretation function, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and click Language of Choice. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message TF Kavya for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Tom. Tom, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kavya. And good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. And very warm welcome to this India country session on business and human rights. As we enter into this 10th year of UNGP on business and human rights, I think which was a significant milestone in broad basing the narrative of business and human rights. And this decade, the last decade, marked some significant gains and also showed us some very important gaps as we move forward. I think one of the significant gains was that it brought the conversation, it broad-based the conversation about human rights. It also brought the conversation about human rights into the boardrooms, even though probably in a sanitized way and not the traditional route of labor capital negotiations, trade union management negotiations. That usually brings the human rights discourse. The broad basing has managed to remove the stigma attached to the whole concept of human rights. It has made that more clear and more non-negotiable aspect of way of doing business. And I think this also brought a wider range of organizations into this bit of this discourse on business and human rights. UN agencies, civil society organizations, academia, consumer groups, investors, and many more. Through these sessions today, we will be exploring and identifying key human rights issues in our country, the obstacles, the drivers, the stakeholders, and last but not the least, concrete steps and suggestions to move forward in this decade of what UN calls the global decade of implementation, which is talking about it and now moving into action. In the country, we have seen some really good steps being taken by the government, proactive steps being taken by the government, particularly Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Since the beginning of the last decade, we've had the National Voluntary Guidelines, we've had the national, which is now the national guidelines. We've had SEBI mandating the business responsibility reports, and we also now have work on the National Action Plan, which is in the making. And more recently, the NHRC has also been brought into this whole idea of business and human rights, and how that segment of business and human rights also should form the agenda of National Human Rights Commission. The civil society space has also been quite active and vibrant, been collaborative with government and other agencies as well in this regard. One example is the corporate responsibility, which is a broad civil society coalition, and one that has been active in this space for a while, and looking at top 500, the BRRs of top 500 listed companies, as well as bringing key civil society voices, organizations like partnering in collaboration with others, bringing out the being active on the National Action Plan and submitting to the government. All of these that are brought by corporate responsibility, as well as by PIC will be put out on the National Action Plan. The links will be put out by my colleagues in the chat box, and you will be able to access them. Now, moving forward, the format today, this session, 2-hour session, is going to be the initial 30 minutes or so of setting the scene, where we'll have couple of speakers who will be really talking about broad areas that we need to be covering, we need to be looking at when we talk about business and human rights. And then we will move on to developing a country roadmap, so to speak, through very participatory discussions, and which will be in the breakout groups. And then I think we will have 10 minutes or so of including and way forward. So that's how today's section is, today's program is panning out. And on the opening session, which is the setting scene, I have 4 speakers. I have Nusrat Khan, Business and Human Rights Specialist of UNDP. I have Shabnam Siddiqui from GCNI. I have Lara Jasani, who's an independent law practice professional of Bombay High Court. And I have Vivek Padare, Director General of Federation of Employees Federation of India. All of speaking on different aspects of business and human rights. So without ado, I look forward to these discussions, and I would invite Nusrat Khan to first talk about international organizations and development partners in the daily process.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure joining all of you at today's session as a South Asia Forum to reflect on the progress, challenges, and opportunities for India in developing a business and human rights framework for our country. The South Asia Forum is a fantastic opportunity to engage with a wide range of stakeholders on the issue. And at today's session, we have diverse representation from businesses, academics, civil society, international organization, and other development partners like Tom mentioned. And each of us is playing a very critical role in moving the needle on the BHR agenda for India. In today's 5 minutes, I will be reflecting on the role and responsibilities of international organization and development partners in working together to promote uptake of responsible business practices in India, adopting multiple strategies, bringing in diverse stakeholders' perspectives, all to sort of make ecosystem which is inclusive and respectful of every individual and communities and stakeholder rights, and also making sure that businesses respectful of these rights remain competitive in global markets. Can I please request the PPT, please? Thanks, Kavya. Multilateral institutions and frameworks for human rights are critical to ensuring that human rights are consistent for individuals across the world, across countries, cultures, and different political systems, and across histories. And they are equally critical and relevant are the UNGPs. The unanimous adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011 marked for the first time a place where an international human rights regime was authoritatively applied to businesses. Take of responsible practices and promotion of these UNGPs. Businesses rely on these principles to guide their human rights policies and due diligence mechanisms, through which they assess, manage, and report on human rights related risks across operations. Over the last decade or so, I think multiple organizations have contributed towards shaping the business and human rights. Sorry? Yes, okay. contributed towards shaping the business and human rights discourse and priorities for India. Inputting into policy frameworks include right from the national voluntary guidelines to the national guidelines on responsible business conduct, and at the moment, the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which is under development. These agencies have included agencies like UNDP, ILO, UNICEF, UN Women, and many other institutions like Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, Praxis, PIC, industry bodies like CII, BHR experts and academics, and multiple trade unions. And the slide that you see is just a slice of this ecosystem, and by no means entirely representative of the huge universe that we have, the ecosystem that we have in India. And I think it is safe to say that India has probably one of the most vibrant international agencies and development partners network in the region, which has so actively contributed to creating rich discourse on business and human rights for the region and for the country. Next slide, please. All these contributions are evident to a review of the journey of business and human rights in India and all the related policy frameworks, starting from the National Voluntary Guidelines in 2011, a guideline which even preceded the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, therefore making India, giving India already a headway in the global action on this issue. And thereafter, the business responsibility frameworks, the national guidelines, and now NAP. There has been constant input from agencies and development partners on these policy frameworks. Over the past 2 years, multiple organizations have held consultations on what the National Action Plan for India should include and what the responsibilities of the government should be, what expectations from businesses should look like, and what are the kind of remedies, what is the remediation frameworks should look like for all stakeholders, and especially people directly affected by business operations. UNDP has also given its submission to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in this respect. Overall, I think agencies and organizations have constantly pushed boundaries for corporate responsibility and related government action on it. Next slide, please. These collective actions have essentially led to creating of an interface or an exchange or integration of global business and human rights standards and domestic policies, leading to a development of a rich business and human rights discourse, which is domestically relevant, as well as upholding of international standards. This is seen in the national guidelines for responsible business conduct, in its alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as in the BRSR frameworks, which speak about global sustainability standards. All this done to create a national action plan and policies which cater to an Indian ecosystem and diversity. Is my voice audible? Sorry, there's a lot of noise at my end.
Yes, Nusrat, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Wrap up in a minute.
Right.
Thanks.
I think I'll jump straight to, Kavya, can you just jump straight to the slide number 7, because paucity of time. UNDP, as part of its consultations on NAP, conducted multiple regional and thematic consultations over the period of 2019 and 20. And some of the key recommendations coming out of these conversations were that government should lead by example through sustainable procurement or through responsible business practices by public sector units. Government should also periodically review all laws, policies pertaining to business and human rights. Reporting on human rights compliance should be made compulsory as part of the annual report by businesses. And protection of human rights defenders and whistleblowers came out as a priority. Next slide, please. I think just to wrap up, as future steps, charting roles for international organization and development partners, I think three priorities for us should align with building momentum for political buy-in on business and human rights, as well as building a business case, linking it clearly to economic growth, of course, linking it to the implications on human rights. But I think it is very critical to communicate with the private sector and as well as the political circles in creating a business case for business and human rights, and how it is necessary to for India to build a policy framework which is robust enough to remain relevant for global conversations and global trade, especially given the movements on human rights due diligence and supply chain laws within the EU and the US. I think it is also very critical for us to build awareness and capacity for MSME sector, and this would include conversations around human rights due diligence and what this actually means for the sector. And I think lastly, building awareness on consumer awareness on sustainability, human rights implications, and ethical sourcing is very integral to sort of involve consumers as a key stakeholders, which would allow us to create conversations on business human rights which are sustainable and long term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nusrat. I'm not sure if we have, I don't see Shabnam. If Shabnam has not joined yet. Okay, we will have Lara. Lara, if you are ready, if you could go next. Lara Jasani is an independent law professional at the Bombay High Court. She'll be speaking on the expectations of human rights defenders and civil society. I forgot to mention earlier that each of the speakers, their bios will be pasted in the chat section. So you will have a fuller profile available to you in the chat section. Over to you, Lara.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'll be talking about the expectations of civil society and human rights defenders with the NAP process, and also with all the business and human rights initiatives. I'm first of all thankful for this opportunity. I think conversations that we are having at the UN South Asia Business and Human Rights Forum are extremely important towards developing a framework that will work. And also in order to recognize civil society voices, I think that are very important in this entire process. I'll just start my presentation. If are you all able to see it? Yes. Okay. India in particular right now is recovering from a really huge crisis, especially an economic crisis that came because of the pandemic lockdown. And that has also resulted in a lot of important conversations that I feel are going to help us in the times to come. One of the biggest challenges that we are faced with is, of course, the regulatory breakdown that is taking place in the country, and the number of violations that we have seen, even in the pandemic situation and the pre-pandemic situation. During the pandemic itself, there were a lot of new reforms that were brought in terms of policy reforms in the labor sector, mining sector, environmental sector, and all of these have been business-led. One of the concerns that have been coming from the civil society is that while we do engage with processes and do engage also with businesses in a hope that we can try and push them towards a more responsible conduct, is there a real intent in these processes to deliver justice and to ensure that civil society concerns are addressed? So I just want to highlight on some of these issues, although I don't have a lot of time. 5 minutes is quite limiting, but I'm sure the discussion sessions we'll have after this will lead to more detailed discussions, and they are important. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights guidance document and the National Action Plan is actually, quite helpful in trying to understand the way in which the NAPs ideally ought to go. And the 4 criteria that have been set out in this document, that is that they need to be founded upon by the United Nations guiding principles. They need to respond to specific challenges of the national context. And so, the challenges concerning India need to be an integral part of India's NAP. They need to be developed and implemented through an inclusive and transparent process. I think this is one of the most important criteria that are that's part of the NAP. If the process is not inclusive, then the concerns of civil society and the local stakeholders, as well as the project affected communities, will not be reflected in the NAP, and hence will not provide an effective remedy system or a justice system to, to take care of their concerns. The NAP also needs to be regularly reviewed and updated, because these concerns are rapidly changing. Like we've seen in the last year, the pandemic has, pushed forward so many concerns that were otherwise on the back burner, including health for that matter, which has now been brought into focus. Some of the concerns that we are facing, especially in India, since we are in the country focused session, is that there has been a systematic bypassing of public consultation processes and community consent through legislative dilutions, and also non-implementation of legislations which provide for these processes. So we are seeing this happen with the Land Acquisition Act, where for many types of projects, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 have in fact been done away with, which provide for social impact assessment. We are seeing this in the environmental laws, where the EIA notification, environmental impact assessment notification of 2006 has been systematically diluted. Many industries and many types of projects and activities have been removed from the requirement of public consultation. We're also seeing non-implementation of the Forest Rights Act. There have also been a lot of dilutions that have taken place through notifications and circulars of both the Forest Rights Act as well as the Panchayat Act. We're also seeing a dismantling and dilution of protective policies. So these govern the mining sector, the environmental sector, the land, land-related rights, and you also have weakening of the labor laws, which have been systematically taken place through interpretation by courts, as well as through policies that are being brought in right now. There's been an easing of regulations to promote doing business, and this is at the cost of the stakeholders. It is at the cost of the project affected communities, and especially the forest dwelling communities, coastal communities, Adivasis, Dalits, and the most marginalized. The weakening of the right to information has also resulted in in reducing the access to remedy, because without this information, it has been extremely difficult to litigate concerns, to take them to forums and authorities, and to also get compensation and reparatory orders. There's also worsening of the situation of labor, environment, and civil liberties. We all know the situation right now in the pandemic time, but even before that, we have seen that we are facing a very big economic crisis. As far as the environment is concerned, we are at the lowest indicators, with being second last in the world on the Global Environment Performance Index as far as air pollution is concerned, at 179 out of 180 countries. We're also seeing a systematic attack on civil liberties, where there has been use of legislations like UAPA, sedition law, and even the criminal offenses in the Indian Penal Code against all voices of dissent. And this especially becomes a matter of concern as far as civil society voices that have been, opposing business violations. There have also been increasing attacks on human rights defenders and shrinking democratic spaces. This is also through the media blackouts that are taking place on several issues, but we are also seeing direct criminalization of human rights defenders. In a situation like this, the mistrust of the civil society is also at the highest, and hence
the requirement to engage them in these processes very constructively to ensure that there is proper implementation in place, I think is very vital if we want to make this process truly fruitful. Some of the apprehensions, which come from the earlier side itself, will the NAP process be truly inclusive? Will there be proper consultation with communities and local stakeholders? We've seen that the zero draft of the National Action Plan has come in, but the consultative processes are still not in place. There has been a demand from civil society. Several civil society organizations have in fact come out and raised the demand that the draft needs to be taken to the very last person, to all the communities, to the remotest of areas of the country, to ensure that their concerns are included in the NAP process. There's a lack of transparency. Not many people are even aware that there is a process such as NAP taking place. If we look at what is happening with the local communities, there is a complete disconnect because of the centralization of all these procedures. It is a total top-down approach. How do we change that? Because that's the only way to build trust between people and businesses and also the state. Another very big concern is that the NAP will just be reduced to a mere guideline, that there will be no enforcement or implementation, because there is no implementation mechanism which has even been proposed in the draft so far. It will not challenge the state business complicity. Now, this is a very important concern, because one of the biggest things that have come out through the understanding of how legislations are being changed, to the understanding how elections are being funded, is also that there is, or how the media is being controlled, is that there is a existing state business nexus. Now, if the NAP process is also controlled by state and business, with very limited civil society participation, how will it challenge the state business complicity in the first place? So it is very important to make the process inclusive and consultative if we really want to address some of the biggest problems that we're facing. The weak monitoring and review mechanisms, I think this concern has been highlighted in earlier sessions as well, and is a very important aspect we need to bring as a part of NAP, that it lacks intent, that it shouldn't be just a mere paper formality. There has to be an intention to actually respect human rights and protect human rights and remedy violations, and that intent is not coming through. Now, just some recommendations, and they're not exhaustive. Like I said, I don't have time to touch upon all of them. Towards an effective NAP process that would include HRD and civil society concerns, we need to make the entire National Action Plan process inclusive and consultative. And for that, we need to also bring in the concerns of all sectors, whether it is the garment workers, whether it is the labor, because we are seeing there is a huge informal labor sector, which is not even on the agenda. How do we bring these concerns into the NAP process? How do we talk about discrimination? How do we make the workspaces safer and equal? I think these things need to be a very, they need to be out on the agenda along with the implementation plan. And for that, we need to make the process consultative with all of these specific groups, and also inclusive, so that none of the stakeholders are left out from the process. It should be guided by voices from the community, the affected voices, and by those who are affected, especially by the projects and activities. Experts, activists, human rights defenders need to be a very integral part of the process. It needs to be led by women, children, persons with disabilities, the LGBTQI community, Dalits, Adivasis, denotified and nomadic tribes, and the minority communities that are in fact at the receiving end of the oppression and the exploitative methods.
Sorry to jump in, Lara. Conclude.
Yes, just give me 30 seconds. It also needs to recognize multiple marginalizations and intersectionalities that many of these communities are facing. It needs to challenge the state corporate nexus. And this it needs to do in a very incisive and decisive way, because if on the one hand we are seeing that there are destructive legislations, and there are dilutions of protective legislations taking place, how will anyone take this voluntary process, or NAP, which is not even really enforceable, seriously? So we need to challenge the state corporate nexus and also ensure implementation, compliance, and monitoring. There also needs to be regulatory control and a demand that the domestic legislations be reviewed in the context of the UNGPs to see if they fulfill the international human rights standards. And if they don't, then the recommendations should be very strongly enforced. They need to be a part of the NAP, and they need to be also a part of our discourse, at the international level. And it also needs to incorporate mandatory due diligence, social environment impact assessment, and it must take into account the concerns of the labor force. So these are some of the few things that I want to highlight here. I'm hoping that we can have more detailed discussions in the session forward. Thank you, Tom, for giving me the extra few minutes.
Thank you so much, Lara. The extra few minutes also came because of some technical difficulties of other speakers not able to join. But nonetheless, I think these are extremely important conversations, and which we must continue. And there's a lot to discuss and share as well. I'm sure all of the participants will also be wanting to contribute to this. So looking at the list of speakers who've not been able to join, I think we will now be able to move straight into the breakout groups. The breakout groups are primarily sessions where we look forward to kind of creating a roadmap, creating this discussion amongst all of us, every one of us who's equally, I think, concerned about the whole idea about business and human rights, and wanting to contribute to this whole process of how our country moves forward, setting examples, setting standards, as we move forward in the arena of business and human rights. So we will now move into the breakout groups. We will have 5 breakout groups, and these are led by key people who are present here. And we will be looking at different aspects which constitute the wholeness of what you could call business and human rights. So we will have one group on business disclosures and benchmarking, which will be facilitated by Namit Agarwal. He is the Asia policy lead of the World Benchmarking Alliance. As I said earlier, all their detailed bios, or more detailed bios than what I am sharing with you, will be in the chat section. You will be able to get to know more about them. The second group will be led by Rishikesh Singh, who's the director of 2020 on the supply chain. So the second group will be on the question of supply chain. And on the third group will be issues around labor. And this will be facilitated by Shanaz Rafiq, who's the national coordinator of the All India Unorganized Workers Congress, and also secretary of the National Platform for Labor, Health and Environment. Then we have the fourth breakout group, which will be on diversity or inclusion and diversity, which is equally critical. And this will be facilitated by Beena Pallikal, General Secretary of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. Then last but not the least, remedies and human rights defenders. That will be facilitated by Malini Asola, co-convener, All India Drug Action Network. Now, all of these breakout groups, what the our support team is going to do is just randomly allocate people into these breakout groups. But considering that some of these issues might be very close to your heart, and you might want to actually contribute in a particular area and not in another one, you will have the option of moving out of that random allocation into a room of your choice. If you have any difficulty, you can always message the support team, and they will be able to move you into your rooms. Any other logistic announcements, Kavya? Otherwise, we could break out into.
Thank you, Tom. Everyone, we are now breaking to.
Kavya, sorry, just 1 second. This is Harpreet. This is a reminder to all the group moderators to make sure that they record the breakout room on their own computers. And because these recording, the breakout rooms would not be recorded on the larger platform. So please, as moderators, please record the group work on your own laptop. Do not choose the option record it to the cloud. Choose the option record it on your computer so that we have access to that recording later. And also in the group work, please feel free to communicate in the language that everybody is most comfortable with. And the group moderators would be taking notes and they would come back and present to the larger group. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Harpreet. So we will now be moving to the breakout portion of the event. To move to the breakout room, you will be automatically moved to the breakout room first. As Tom mentioned, if you would like to select the breakout room of your choice, you can select the breakout room feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. There you will see the list of topics being discussed in each rooms. If you hover over a topic, you will see the option that says join. If you would like to move from one breakout room to the other, please select that join feature. However, we recommend staying in the same breakout room for the entirety of the discussion. That being said, we will now move to the breakout rooms. Enjoy all. Hello all. Thank you for joining us for this session. The session has currently moved to breakout rooms for the group work portion. If you would like to select a breakout room of choice, please select the breakout room feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the topic of your choice. If you need any support doing this, please feel free to message me via the chat box. I will also be assigning breakout rooms to all participants randomly. Within the next few moments, you might be moved to a breakout room for the group work. Thank you. Hello all. Thank you for joining us. We will soon be assigning you to the breakout room group work session that is currently happening. You can also move from one breakout room to the other, depending on the topic of your choice. We will now be assigning everyone to specific breakout rooms. Recording here, and I'm disabling the ability for participants to unmute themselves from here on. Closing all rooms in 3, 2, 1. Hello all, welcome back. All breakout rooms are now closed and all participants are back in the plenary.
Thank you, Kavya, and welcome back, everybody. I'm sure you've had some very good discussions and some inconclusive ones as well, because 45 minutes isn't too much of a time. But nonetheless, I'm sure the facilitators would have captured the key points from your discussion, key aspects of how we actually build our roadmap for our country as we move ahead on this theme of business and human rights. Without much delay, let me invite each of the speakers, moderators back to report on the key discussion points that you've come up with. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Instead of 6 minutes, if you can wrap it up in 5 minutes, your points, that'll be great, so that we can close this part of the session by 3:45.
Thanks, Tom. And I was part of the group 1, which looked at business disclosures and benchmarking. And we had a great discussion. And I was happy that there were more points on the recommendations and solutions rather than challenges. So that's a good change to see in the last couple of years. So I'll just try and, I can't summarize because there are a lot of points. But on the first question, looking at the pressing business and human rights issues from a disclosure and benchmarking perspective, one of the things that came out was the lack of buy-in from the private sector, or the lack of a business case for them to get more interested and engaged in some of these processes and take it seriously. Lack of standardization, particularly on implementation There is also not enough mechanisms to enforce some of the legislations and guidelines. That is creating a challenge. And then the whole push around, looking at all indicators and national frameworks around the ease of doing business often takes away the constituency of labor and community. So these were some of the pressing issues that were highlighted in the group. On the obstacles and drivers, some of the obstacles were very similar in terms of the lack of a business case. But I think one thing that was clearly coming out was the role of MSME sector, the micro, small, medium enterprises in the BHR space, also looking at the informal sector and the large scale informality, not just in India, but I think most parts of Asia, which is a big hurdle in dealing with some of these challenges. Of course, there is a lack of political will, and looking at engaging more and more parliamentarians and other to start talking about the impact of their impact of businesses in their constituency was something that was addressed. It's also important to maintain the push and pull between the balance between business and civil society, because the ultimate idea is to have more engagement rather than confrontation. That was also highlighted. And there were several recommendations. I'll come to the recommendations at the last. In terms of stakeholders, the idea was to look beyond the usual suspects. And we felt that the role of the National Human Rights Commission can be expanded, and they're already doing some work on this front, but expanding their purview to also look at non-state actors and their accountability, which will be pertinent from a business and human rights perspective. Engaging ministries such as Ministry of Labor, Women, Child, and the MSME Ministry in the conversation. Also industry bodies, not just the CIIs and FICCIs, which are already involved, but others, and perhaps at the state level as well. A lot of the talk right now is at the union and center level. Therefore, looking at the role of state governments and agencies at the state will be important. Role of institutions and academia, business, engineering, law is very, very important, not just from what they are teaching, but also what is their impact, and are they disclosing, are they assessing their own human rights impact, because that can be huge. On the recommendation side, I'll just read out a few. One was having mandatory reporting, or at least some sort of effective implementation mechanism, because that is completely lacking. Capacity building came out a couple of times, not just businesses and civil society, but also government, who should be able to understand what to do with the reporting data that is coming up. There are millions of small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises in the country. Given the capacity constraints, it will be impossible to use the data if the MSME sector starts reporting. So adopting a cluster development approach will be very, very useful. And then just last point on applying the right to information on businesses, especially those working with governments or on government projects, where they should have a public information officer, and disclosure should not be an annual exercise, but on a real-time basis, which will facilitate more engagement with a variety of stakeholders. Just one last point I wanted to flag. It was also mentioned that often a lot of the benchmarks are seen as an end in itself. Companies try to talk about the score or the rank that they have got, but it's important to move away from looking at benchmarks and indices as an end, but as a process of engagement. And I think that is very much important at this stage. Thanks, Tom. I think there are much more points, but I'll share that at a later point.
I'm sure. Thank you so much, Namit, for sticking to time and bringing those points so well. I'm sure this conversation, this is just the beginning of one of those conversations, and it will continue. So if I may now call upon Rishi for the discussions that you've had on the supply chain. Rishi.
Thank you, Tom. And I want to thank all the participants who were in the supply chain section. Very short time, we were like doing rapid fire and we somehow got it together. So let me talk about the pressing business and human rights issues. The group spoke about labor rights as a whole. There's like plethora of issues in the country, and when we look at different layers of the supply chain, there are different issues. So some of the things were diversity and inclusion, modern slavery, child labor, things with migrants, trafficking, etc. So there are a lot of things which came out. So labor rights as a whole. We also spoke about issues linked with the environment and the climate, water pollution, groundwater contamination, right to clean environment, climate change, SDGs, and also now the pandemic, which has opened up a lot of cracks into the system. The third pressing issue was about lack of awareness. So how do we look at the whole aspect about lack of awareness as such of business and human rights, and also lack of awareness of access to remedy, and also acceptance of business and human rights into the business spheres and discussions is some of the issues which were highlighted. Then we went to the key obstacles and drivers. So one of the biggest obstacle which was noted down was lack of transparency. So today we are running businesses, we don't know what is coming from where, supply chains are very opaque. And also the things about the complaint mechanisms. Right now, there are no safe spaces for workers to report abuses, because there could be brutal force and violence against them on the ground. So that's a very big obstacle. There are also things like inequality, indebtedness, poverty, etc., which is heightening some of the issues in the country, like bonded labor, trafficking, etc. That was an obstacle. The whole issue about women and lack of capacity building towards women and different segments within the women groups and other rights holders, I would add from my side, was an obstacle. Also, the one of the drivers could be agreement amongst all social partners, whether they're businesses or civil societies or the government departments. We agree on things we want to do together. And also it's like an obstacle and driver both, how to be build knowledge on issues like bonded labor, which employers and workers both don't understand at all. And there are other issues as well, which are lost into, like a shades of gray, not totally understood. So the third area is about concrete recommendations. Like Namit's group, we had a lot of recommendations. So that's great. I like solution orientation. The biggest recommendation was that we need more effectiveness of laws. India has wonderful laws. We've been hearing this, in all discussions we hear this. And also things like there's some cultural context things which happen on the ground. Skill transfer leading to child labor, or, children helping family and agriculture farms happens very commonly. Also about increased transparency and knowing and showing from reporting and more disclosures from businesses and companies, and a very clear tone from the top government in terms of what the intent is, leading by example, things like public procurement and the business activities which the government does, and also the issue of MSMEs, focusing more on that. We also spoke about the most spoken topic these days, mandatory human rights due diligence. So our group felt that is also one of the recommendations they felt. Also the idea about covering more companies and people. Currently what work we're doing needs more coverage. So whether it is documentation of good practices, whether it's awareness building, whether it's coverage of subcontractors which work in some supply chains, and whether it is a focus group of getting buy-in from businesses, especially those who are not the leaders. Normally we talk about businesses who are the leaders in this space, and we forget about the other side of the curve, and businesses which have not really come on the table as of now. Last is about key stakeholders. The key stakeholders we identified were obviously environments and human rights defenders, the labor department, some of the enforcement departments like the police, which is very important for trafficking and controlling bonded labor. The small businesses as such should be on the table, because that's the larger part of business and supply chain. And last but not least, about public procurement. How can government get its right to act together as well and set up some examples. So public procurement as a very important stakeholder, public procurement departments. I'll take a pause there. Hope we got it well in time.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Rishi. I'll call upon Shanas to bring out the points that you've had about labor. Shanas. Shahnaz, you need to unmute. You are muted. You still have to unmute. It's gone back to mute again.
Thank you, Tom.
Yes.
The breakout room of the labor was a very lively room. And with regard to the human rights issues of the country and identifying 3-4 issues, there was power imbalance, fragmented supply chain, lack of social dialogue, largely missing from the discourse, and gender inequality, discrimination, inequality that rose out. And then there was also noted that the informalized work, issues related to the home-based workers specifically, child labor and forced labor, and lack of grievance mechanisms with very poor or low wages. There was also discussed situation of contractual workers, lack of safety net and social protection, lack of awareness of policies, and also lack of implementations. The question that came up very frequently was informalization and cheap labor and daily wages. When we reached to the second obstacles and drivers issues, there was including workers' voices, making it more inclusive. The process should be more inclusive. Again, power imbalance was being noted, creating a business case where shift from right-based framework and building accountability and building policies, creating safe places for workers to share issues and grievances, including voices of workers, access to justice and access to remedy, with intersectionality across gender, caste, class, etc. The third issue that came up regarding recommendations, the House voted for policy building strengthening the policy building environment, spreading knowledge and awareness among the workers with regard to access to remedial measures, strengthening the trade unions and like-minded groups, have departments and cells within each business to look into working hours violations, having sector-specific guidelines, and corporate criminal liability. The last issue that we touched was what are the key stakeholders. It was the ILO, UN agencies, NHRCs, SHRCs, employees and trade unions, ministries, labor, law and justice, and of course, businesses. So it was a highly interactive session. Thank you for giving that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shahnaz. Brilliantly put. We will move on to the next one, which is primarily on the issue of diversity and inclusion. Beena, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Quite a very less time to discuss such a huge topic, but we just tried to, try to put the things quickly in the four guiding questions that you've given us. So in terms of what are the issues, there were 3 or 4 large issues that have come out. Definitely the gender inequality is one major block that has come out. The other one is looking at caste-based discrimination at the workplace and the issues of disability rights. So under gender inequality, there was gender-based violence, sexual harassment at the workplace, and the gender gap, both the leadership gap as well as the pay gap. Whereas on the other hand, there was definitely the caste-based discrimination, and therefore the issue of the whole public-private partnerships and the public moving to private. Therefore, many of the marginalized communities like Dalits and Adivasis will lose their livelihood and job because the reservation policy is pegged in the public sector. And of course, all this into one other issue of not having any kind of grievance mechanisms. So no grievance mechanisms to address this, and therefore workers being devalued, etc. And no way how they can escalate the issues that are happening. Seldom, we discussed that seldom people don't want to report because they're scared to lose their job, etc. What are the key obstacles and drivers? Policy can be both an obstacle as well as a driver. If it is an inclusive policy, it can be a driver. If it's not, then it becomes an obstacle. Definitely lack of political will to ensure that many of these things happen. Lack of awareness and understanding also from the part of the employees and people who are working. And incentives and disincentives. So incentivizing companies that have good models and disincentivizing if we find contrary to that. The 3 concrete recommendations. So a lot of recommendations have come out, but I'll try to sort of club them together. So one is strengthening all the institutions. So strengthening the NHRIs, that is one aspect of it. The other recommendation is, of course, having effective implementation for binding legislation. So till now we have voluntary guidelines, etc., but can we have policy and legislation that is binding so that it can be followed to the T? Not that they follow it here, but at least we'll have something on paper. So that means addressing issues like caste-based discrimination, gender-based discrimination, etc. And of course, having public procurement, to ensure, like, for example, bonded labor, and to ensure that how they are taking into, they are having mechanisms that will not lead into preventing, or that will not lead into slavery. So sort of preventing modern slavery. And of course, the whole whistleblowers, protection of whistleblowers and grievance mechanisms, we club it together. And the last one, what I would say is informal sector. We had some discussion on informal sector, that what should be the recommendation regarding that, because it is a little complicated. There was also a thought that ILO's recommendation is that make them formal, but is that the way we want to go, is something that is kept as we didn't have sufficient time to discuss that. The fourth one, the key stakeholders, again, all the commissions and institutions, so Commission on SC/STs, the Safai Karmachari Commission, there is the Women's Commission, there is the National Human Rights, so all that. Of course, nodal ministries, Ministry of Social Justice, Labor, etc. Then we have trade bodies, so CIF, FICCI, ASSOCHAM, and then we have the trade unions, and of course, the businesses themselves, and organizations like SEVA, etc., which are mostly community-based organizations, and consortiums that look at different thematics, like, for example, disability rights, LGBTQI, Dalit, Adivasi rights. That's all. Thanks, Dr.
Thank you so much, Beena. Next, the last one, not the least, is Malini on the remedies, the key question of remedies. Over to you, Malini.
Thank you, Tom. So our group was dealing with these 4 questions in the context of remedies and human rights defenders. In response to the first question, which was what were the most pressing issues related to BHR, we had many different suggestions. One was regarding the complexity of existing remedies and the fragmentation of existing remedies, which posed a problem. Also, the fact that companies' remedies do not necessarily extend into the supply chain. That was another one named. Also, the lack of remedies, recourses in the informal space. So for workers who are home-based or contractual workers, There were other issues raised, like the increasing attacks on human rights defenders, the dilution of mandatory regulatory frameworks and laws, and relatedly, the absence of any legislative or regulatory frameworks where required in order to regulate the businesses. And also need for also an issue related to poor enforcement and implementation of the existing laws. Then another issue that was brought up was the huge amount of judicial delays, and therefore linked to that, the need for more judicial forums to be able to take up these kinds of cases. Then also noted was a shift from the mandatory frameworks towards voluntary guidelines. And in many people's experience, as we know, the voluntary mechanisms are not really operating as they should be. And so this is a trend that is a negative trend. And then, I mean, there are more suggestions. I'll just end with one more, which is related to poor reporting of human rights violations. Then moving on to the second question, which was about obstacles and drivers. Some of the obstacles we identified were related to awareness. So firstly, the inability to access relevant information on business and human rights, as well as the lack of awareness on the part of corporations about the consequences that they might face if they violated human rights. Then also policy direction since the pandemic started towards the government moving into infrastructural development overdrive, coupled with the dilution of laws and dismantling and dilution of protective policies. That is another obstacle. And then finally, the lack of a supportive ecosystem, erosion of democratic spaces, repression of civil society voices, and weakening of the right to information. In terms of drivers, it was felt that a better understanding of each of the processes that related to business and human rights could be a driving force. If better understanding would help related to even the NAP process, etc. Increased public awareness at the moment regarding some rights, and this was brought up by me in the context of healthcare. More opportunities for conversations have arisen, especially since the COVID pandemic began, for economic and social rights. And reporting mechanisms that were pushed, are being pushed by civil society are also a ground for asking for information as a right. Also named were the current protests and the people's movements that are ongoing, and the fact that there is more involvement of the younger generation and other human rights defenders and younger generation in the context of climate change. Then in the third question, which was about providing recommendations, I'm afraid we had quite a few, so I'm just going to name them quickly, some of them. The need for strong mandatory legal frameworks to protect human rights. And the rationale for this is that without such a legal framework, the UNGPs cannot be enforced because they presuppose a mandatory legal framework. The need for reversal of the dilutions to the laws and strengthening of the laws. Public consultation processes which need to be adhered to and put in place in activities that would affect local stakeholders. Also the need to bring legislation or regulation where absent. In terms of NHRC, we discussed that there needs to be a proactive role with respect to business and human rights. The orders that are currently being passed are only recommendatory in nature and need to be made enforceable. And also that the institution needs to be more effective by creating a mandate to deal with BHR cases. Then the mandatory reporting requirements for companies are very limited and restricted to the top 500 companies. So we need a move towards expanding those reporting of expanding the non-financial reporting of these companies to beyond that very limited criteria. Companies that are involved in extractive projects. Here, we have said that there needs to be respect for the consent standards, and businesses need to take responsibility towards rehabilitation of the communities. Then in terms of state business complicity, we have said that there needs to be disclosures in terms of electoral bonds and funding of funding of political parties, and also that they need to be this state business nexus needs to be dealt with through mandatory guidelines. Also, a need for more judicial and non-judicial authorities and mechanisms for grievance redressal need to be put in place, and legislation to protect human rights defenders, and to be able to also respect the constitutional freedoms guaranteed to communities and stakeholders. And the last question was about the key stakeholders. Here we have talked about, firstly, the people who are directly impacted by violations and the communities. Then also, of course, the courts of law and other judicial and quasi-judicial forums, various ministries, these have been named by other groups as well, civil society, human rights defenders, the corporates, business associations and lobby groups, and of course the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which is involved in drafting of the NAP and has put out the voluntary guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Malini. There's a lot of points that have come in, and I'm sure all of this will get captured and be circulated. I'm not going to attempt summing up. I'm also keeping watch on the time. We'll move into the next session, which is the concluding session and the way forward. I will request Harpreet to give your thoughts on the way forward and some concluding thoughts, Harpreet. You're on mute, Harpreet.
Sorry, there was some technical glitch. Thanks, Tom. Just like you, I don't think I would even dare to even try to conclude the conversations today. I think really important conversations. A lot of issues were identified. I think in some ways we've really made a progress. To what Namit said at the beginning is. In the group discussion, there were a lot more conversations about the solutions, about the recommendations, and I think that's where at least we see in terms of how there's been a shift in terms of how we are approaching a particular issue, and that's something that I heard across various groups, that there were lots of recommendations that were coming up, and these recommendations varied from to voluntary measures to mandatory to mandatory measures, and I think there's no either or. Maybe the way that it's going to work is we'll have to sort of take both of these together. I think I hope that this South Asia Forum and particularly these country sessions have been able to bring together the different conversations, the different actors and stakeholders together, and we hope that this collaboration that we've established here through the country session, that many of these recommendations that came up today would be meaningless if we do not follow it from here. So I think I would really urge all of you to stay engaged in the conversation, and really also taking this opportunity to thank Tom, and Partners in Change and Praxis to help us organize this country session. I think this was, this was one country session which all of us were really looking forward to. So thank you, Tom, and your team for organizing this so well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. And I think thank you for all the efforts that you're putting together to bring this South Asia context together. And I think these are significant events that contribute to progress in terms of the discussion on business and human rights. Thank you once again. Viraf, if I may request you, Viraf is the adjunct faculty at IICA, as well as associated with Partners in Change. Viraf, over to you.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry. Go ahead, Viraf.
Okay. Since the introduction to IICA, obviously friends are aware that I've been part of the process of drafting some of the national guidelines, the reporting frameworks, and being involved with the NAP and NHRC and formal processes over the last 2-3 years in particular. As part of these comments, I was online early morning today, hearing about the SDGs, attended all day. I tried to participate in the reporting session this afternoon. Friends, I think that as concluding remarks, I don't want to make the Indian NAP the centerpiece of the discussion. It will take place. You may or may not be satisfied. We may or may not have comments, but it'll be our first NAP and a test of what is practically achievable. And I think that the thought here is that we put together a package of content that is actually doable, given the number of groups that have reported the usual phenomenon of having good things on paper poorly implemented, be they laws or guidelines or plans. But I think that the doable things that we put in there require us as never before to establish a series of dialogues and approaches with key players that can change at least the drivers and the political will in India to move forward with the business and human rights agenda. Similarly, our efforts and our contributions to the journey of the legally binding instrument is an ongoing journey. The NAP, we may well have a document before June or not, but it's the wider, bigger picture, and we have a time like no other for all the reasons all of you have described so well as a point of time in history to truly change things. And we have to therefore employ strategies we have not previously employed. For example, I think that irrespective of the movement of the state or its political will, drivers such as the financial sector in its entirety, with investor groups and with their substantial influence, with, and I could say a little bit more about the National Human Rights Commission, state human rights commissions, all the other commissions that exist for categories of the vulnerable, marginalized, excluded, with select media, conversations between human rights, NGOs and activists, trade unions working with formal labor, organizations working in the informal labor associations and unions of domestic workers, home-based workers, parliamentarians that need to be reached out to, engaging with business. I think that one of the things we see this year, and I recall Tom's opening remarks about the language achieved a breakthrough in that people are talking openly about human rights and not hiding under some other language and not refusing to be explicit. Yes, of course. But how many fora do we have where we can talk to business as civil society, say all the things we've said today directly to the heads of chambers, CEOs of companies, chairpersons of companies? Where is this platform? Why don't we propose one? To at least be able to select and to get some champions from business and to air our views directly on the content of human rights due diligence, topics such as reporting, supply chain transparency, diversity, and all the best topics you've discussed today. Civil society needs to, in a sense, I think for ourselves, need to regroup certain strategies, not relying on what we have in the past, and directly with our competence and our enormous influence collectively, ask for appointment with the people that matter now, whether this is the minister themselves, corporate affairs and so forth. And I think that it could be an offer to establish a dialogue with the entities that ultimately, in this case, business has to perform. With the NHRC, if I may end on a special note here, I think, Tom, yourself and many other colleagues, we are aware that you're members now of a new core group for business environment. I'm aware that the NHRC even has an online complaint service. We need as never before to work with these commissions, visit them, meet their top people, the Secretary General, the justices, the chairpersons, and put forward a case that we could take forward. 3, 4, 5 things that can be culled out of today's conversation, the previous Corporate Responsibility Watch, and initiate an ongoing discussion between a group of us. And this group then takes the responsibility of sharing it down the line, so that we are assured that if 100 NGOs or civil society organizations are behind each of these approaches and different representatives approach, there's a way of taking this feedback back to the grassroots, back to the level that people have expressed a concern that it's not reaching. So I think that here is a parallel challenge to us. How many of us have institutionalized in civil society the notion of engaging with markets? What are the shortcomings of our knowledge on business? What are the platforms that we can create directly to engage with small business, business chambers, large companies, to express grievances and so forth? And I think that the key, I am completely optimistic that these can work, provided they are tried and we get over our own silos of environment to working on ethics or this type of organization on that, and come up with a common manifesto. This I think will be historic, and I think the NAP will, if done properly, can really enshrine and give us the confidence that we have put into things that we can deliver on in 36 months to the nation, or 50 months or 40 months, deliver on. And with that knowledge, have the credibility, the confidence, the support to go on to NAP2. But NAP2 will be a very different thing from the first effort. So I think we're at an incredible crossroads, and in a separate conversation, I think we have to encourage ourselves to think about the box. It's not the same, we'll reach out to the ministry and write to the CII or FICCI. This is way beyond that opportunity now. It's well within our grasp if we are willing to come to the table anew, and as individuals and organizations lend our collective voice, influence, knowledge to approaching people who have the weight to change things in our country. And let's give it a fair shot before we reject it, or before we've started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viraf, for those very both critical, optimistic, and looking at situation as is and how we could actually move forward in that. Thank you so much. Our last speaker, Vidya. Vidya from a industry perspective, Vidya of Aditya Birla Group. If you would like to share your thoughts, Vidya. Do we not have Vidya?
Yeah, as of now, she's not there. She was there for some time back.
Okay. So, okay, I think it's for anyway. So thank you so much for, this rich level of conversation, this rich amount of interaction, and not just interaction, looking at an issue and adding more challenges to that issue, but also looking at how do we actually move forward the road ahead in that sense. So I'm not going to be in any position to sum up all of this, as I said earlier. It is a very rich discussion, particularly all of those conversations that you've had in the breakout groups, fantastic points. But if I may add on to looking at what I got from this, in a sense, is that if we look at the whole 3 pillars of the protect, respect, remedy kind of a pillar, and that's what we are working with when we move forward. That's a framework that will help us embed this business and human rights into our discussions, into our practice, into our mechanisms of monitoring and more. So if we look at that kind of that framework as our central piece, then I heard many of you from the groups come up with this whole idea about where is this framework operating? This framework seems to be operating in a highly unequal power relationships. That's kind of the bottom line on which this framework is operating currently. So there is an inequality of power relationship, and that is a reality. And therefore, that's something which we must place this, the 3 pillars onto while understanding the issue. And on top, I think top or side, whichever way you want to look at it, there seems to be, if policies are a way forward, there seems to be, some of you suggested, a lack of political will, or at least lack of enough political will to create policies and arbitrate in favor of the less powerful. So that's the kind of frame, kind of the bandwidth within which we are operating. On the one hand, we have unequal power relationship. On the other hand, there is a issue in terms of creating that enough political will to do that. So I think Namit and others were talking about lack of business case. I think there is also a lack of political case. I think both needs to be built. And therefore, I think how do we do that? I think if you keep this in this, look at this 3 pillars within this boundaries, then I think there are a lot of suggestions that came in terms of collaboration. Viraf and every one of you in your discussions and opening remarks talked about the importance of collaboration with investor groups, with consumer groups, with human rights commissions, with media, and even more importantly, I think youngsters. One of the groups also mentioned the youngsters, both as consumers as well as active citizens or conscious citizens. I think that also plays an important role. Then, of course, there is the need for real-time transparency, real-time information. But the core of it, I think, goes, broadly goes around the idea of collaboration, solidarity, and that needs to be expanded. And the last decade has seen that it is moving forward. It is broad basing. And I think that's the way forward, definitely. And since that is happening, I think it's an optimistic note. But it is also, we know there's enough and more to be done. And I do share the optimism that we will be able to move into the what the UN calls the decade of implementation of business and human rights. And I do hope to have these conversations and get the notes from these discussions as well, which will help us, each one of us who are involved in this work, as we move forward in these conversations in separate spaces as well. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, and look forward to keeping up this issue of business and human rights and the debate and implementation ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and everyone for a successful session. Before we close, can I request all moderators, speakers, and participants to please turn on your video so that we can take one group picture before closing. Please turn on your videos.
Very good idea.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Kavya. That was the longest we've had to keep our smiles on.
Really.
I wonder what we would call this. We will call this Zoom fee. Is it like a selfie?
Yeah, Zoom fee. Good one. See ya. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Rishi, Nusrat, yeah.